Sandra, have you wanted to paint water droplets in watercolor, but when you looked online for inspiration, it seemed to be too complicated, advanced, or intimidating? I'm going to demonstrate an easy method where I break it down into 3 simple steps. To paint a water droplet, you need 3 things. 1, a highlight on the side the light is shining on. 2, a shadow inside the droplet on the side the light is shining on. This is counterintuitive, but it is caused by the refraction of light through the droplet. 3rd, a cast shadow behind the droplet away from the light source. You can either paint transparent water droplets as an afterthought on a leaf, or brighter droplets painted on white paper by using negative space to paint the leaf around the water droplets. The droplets painted on white paper do stand out more, but the ones on the leaf look truly transparent. First, I'm just going to paint a leaf on my paper wet on dry. I'm going to mix up some medium green. I chose Hooker's green. If I just use one color, it's going to look very flat. So I'm going to also prepare some Aureolin yellow and mix that in with the green to create a brighter green. And I'm going to prepare a little bit of ultramarine blue. When I mix that in with the Hooker's green, it's going to create a darker green. So I'll have the 3 shades to draw from, and I'm not going for realism here. I just want to get this leaf shape down. We'll just keep it really simple. When you want crisp line these dry paper, what you want to do is keep it really wet so that as you're working, it's not drying on you and creating hard lines. So if you keep it nice and wet, it will flow and bleed together like this. I'm just going to try to work from one area to another so that I can keep it all blended together. The one thing you want to try to avoid doing is outlining the entire leaf and then trying to fill it in, because the outside will start to dry and then it'll form a hard line and you'll have trouble blending it. You can see that I just painted 1/2 of the leaf. This is going to form a hard line, and that's fine with me because that can be the middle vein. So that's a good strategy. If it's too big of an area to work in, just do half the leaf, and that way it gives you time to play. So then I'll do the other side and I won't touch it. I can fill in the middle line later. Now we're going to wait for it to completely dry, and then we'll paint our transparent water droplets. While we're waiting, let's paint another leaf. So this time I'm going to draw my water droplets on my paper before I paint my leaf, and then I'm going to paint my leaf around the water droplets. If you want to, you can draw your leaf in. I sometimes don't like to draw it because then it means I have to paint within the lines and it makes the painting a lot harder. Sometimes it's just easier to wing it. We're not going for realism here. This is just a demonstration and we're just supposed to be having fun. So I'm not going to worry too much about my leaf shape. This is a strawberry leaf that I just picked from my garden. If you want to paint from reference photos, I have links to my reference photos in the description below. But I'm just trying to get this down, and I'm not too worried about the leaf itself because this is a water droplet demonstration, not a leaf demonstration. So it's okay if our leaves aren't perfect. Don't stress about that. I'm not too concerned if I end up getting some backgrounds or blossoms because that just adds to the leaf texture. So that's fine. Okay, so now we need to wait for both leaves to dry. So while they're drying, I'll go through the steps with you on some water droplets and we'll practice down here. So why don't you go ahead and draw some water droplets. First, let's paint the shadow that's inside the water droplet. The shadow inside is actually on the side facing the light. We're going to pretend that the light is coming from the top left up here. So I'm going to use cobalt blue. And first I'm going to wet the water droplet with water. So you want to wet it evenly so the whole water droplet is nice and shiny, but you don't want your water beating up on the paper like an actual water droplet like this. If it's beating up like this, then the color is just going to flow everywhere and be so pale. So if that happens to you, just use a damp brush and wick it back up. Dry your brush, wick it back up. So what you want is even and shiny, but not raised above the surface of the paper. Then you're going to take a little bit of cobalt blue and you're just going to dab it into the side near the light source. And it will gently bleed all by itself into the other side. And depending on how wet it is how far it will travel. So if it travels throughout your whole water droplet, you can lift some out by using a clean brush, dabbing it off on your towel, and you could lift a little bit. If your water droplet is too dry, then the paint may not travel at all. So then you may need to use a little bit more paint or wet your water droplet a little bit more. Let's practice again. So again, clear water. This time I'm going to paint it on dry paper, and I'm just painting the cobalt blue and I'm painting around highlight. So this is negative space painting. So there's my highlight, and then I'm going to dip my brush in water, dab it off on my towel, and overlap my last brush stroke. And dip my brush in water, dab it off on my towel, and overlap the last brush stroke again. Dip my brush in water, dab it off on the towel, and overlap that. Clean my brush, dab off that excess water, that's really important, and then just erase the edge down here. That will give you a clean gradient and it leaves a little dry highlight up at the top of the water droplet. I just like to do it on dry paper like this and just paint around, and then I'm going to create my gradient. So I dip my brush in water, I dab it off on my towel, really getting all that extra water off the end of my brush, and I overlap my last brush stroke slowly. Dip my brush in water, dab off that extra water on my towel, and just slowly overlap my last brush stroke. Dip, dab, I call this the dip and dab method, slowly overlap. You want to keep going until you run into nothing. So I'm going to clean my brush, dab it off on my towel, and just erase the edge there. That creates a very nice gradient, and I've got my little highlights there. Now to create a highlight in the raindrop where I did wet and wet, that's easy too. I just take an X-Acto knife or a utility knife, scalpel, and I'm just going to nick it. So I'm going to take the tip of the blade, dig it into the tip of the water droplet when it's completely dry, and I'm going to press hard and flick it, and it'll create a highlight there. And then there's going to be this little piece of paper, actually the surface of the paper that ripped off, and it's going to create a little shadow. So to get rid of it, I can just scrape it off. There we go. And you can do more than one as well. It's a really handy little trick. The next step is the drop shadow. So one thing to be careful of when you're doing your drop shadow is not to use a big thick brush on the side of your raindrop, or you'll end up getting a shadow that goes way out to the side. We want it thin, thin, thin beside the raindrop, and then it goes out a little thicker as it gets away from the light. So I'm just going to use some ultramarine blue. You want to make sure your paintbrush is coming to a tip. So you want to twirl your brush off of your palette and then dab off the extra paint so that you can get a very thin line, and you're just going to go thinly beside your raindrop and out to the end like that. So just start that and then just try to get a tiny bit on the sides, hardly any. And if your shadow looks too dark to you, you can use a piece of paper towel to dab it off. You want to rough it up so that it gets rid of that texture that's on paper towel, just like that. Again, so I've got some ultramarine blue, and I'm just going to paint the drop shadow away from the light. It doesn't have to be this big. It's up to you. Depends on how high your light source is. But if you make a mistake, the shadow's going to get longer and longer as you correct it. And then that looks quite dark to me, so I'm just going to lighten it with my paper towel. All right, let's paint these water droplets first, since we've just had practice doing these types. The first one I am going to paint wet into wet. So first I'm going to wet the water droplet, and this is beading up right away. So what I do is I dab my brush on my towel to dry it off, and then I soak up that extra water. That way, once it flattens, I'm able to spread it around. And I just dry my brush again and just make sure this bottom part isn't too wet, because I don't want the blue color going all the way to the bottom of the raindrop. I'm going to use cobalt blue for the shadow, and I'm going to use ultramarine blue for the cast shadow. I'm going to dip my brush in cobalt blue, and then I'm just going to dab right up at the top near the side that the light is shining on. This is the opposite of what you would think, and it's just going to bleed into my raindrop. If you want to do any touch-up, you want to dry your brush off very well. So if I want to touch this up right here, I don't want to just dip my brush in water and then flood my raindrop. I want to clean my brush and dry it off very well on my towel, and then I can just feather this little imperfection here. Also, if you find that the cobalt blue has completely inundated your entire water droplet and you want to lift some of this back out, you can use a damp brush, dry it off on your towel, and just press near the bottom and slowly lift back towards the place where you place the color, and it will just lift off a soft highlight. Okay, this next one we'll try the other method. I'm going to paint wet on dry, and I'm going to paint around my highlight. And dip my brush in water, dab it off on my towel, and overlap my last brush stroke. Dip my brush in water, dab it off on my towel, and overlap that last brush stroke. Oh no, that was way too wet. Dry, 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 dry. Lift. Dry, dry, dry. Lift. And I'm just going to use a paper towel to make sure it doesn't keep spreading. That's okay, I don't think it did too much damage. I'm going to get a little bit of hard lines up here where it pushed the pigment upwards, and that's why my towel is so important, taking off that extra water. I must have had some on this part of my brush, which drew down onto my paintbrush and onto the paper. Okay, let's try that again. I'm going to paint around my highlights, dip my brush in water, dab off the extra, make sure it's really actually dabbed off this time. Look at this, some water on my paintbrush. Get that off too. That's probably what happened last time. Overlap my last brush stroke, dip my brush in water, dab it off on my towel, overlap my last brush stroke again, very slowly, dip my brush in water, dab it off on my towel, and just feather that out. There. Now to put the highlight in my first water droplet where we painted it wet and wet, I'm just going to give it a nick. And then I'm going to scrape away the little shadow created by the piece of paper that's lifted there. Just going to take that off. So it's literally taken off the top layer of paper, and that's why the paint isn't there anymore. It's literally down to the second layer of white paper. Okay, now the exciting part. We're going to paint completely transparent water droplets on this leaf over here. So again, the first thing I'm going to do is paint my shadow. I'm going to be using my utility knife to create the highlight, so I don't need to worry about painting around it. So I'm just going to use the wet and wet method. I'm going to paint an invisible water droplet just with clear water. And I'm going to dab off on my towel and pull up any extra water, especially at the bottom end here. And while doing so, hopefully I can lift a little bit of that original color off my paper. So I'm just using a damp brush, going back and forth, and then drying it on the towel, and actually lifting some of that original color. And then I'm going to use my cobalt blue and dab it on the side facing the light source, and it's going to create the shadow inside the droplet. Dry my brush. While we're waiting for that to dry, let's paint a wool here with clear water. Dry my brush. I'm just rubbing back and forth to create a little highlight. Dab off on my towel, and just back and forth a little bit down at the bottom here. Dab off on my towel. And then I'm going to use some of that cobalt blue, and I'm just going to put it on the side that the light is shining on and let it bleed into there. Okay, while we're waiting for this to dry, let's paint our cast shadows on the other water droplets over here. If it's too dark, go ahead and use a paper towel to wad it. I think these are dry over here, but just to make sure, I'm going to press them with the paper towel. And then I'm going to paint my cast shadow. Next, I'm going to lift a highlight. So I'm going to use the tip of my utility knife, and I'm going to press it hard into the tip and then push and flick it over. I can do a couple there. Oh no! I flicked it right onto my leaf. I'll just try to repair that. There. Pretend that never happened. You can also use more controlled movements with your scalpel rather than flicking it, and that's by just gently scraping over the same area multiple times, and you can create more controlled shapes with your scraping. There, isn't that cool? It just comes to life when you put the highlight in. Oh my gosh, I just love these raindrops that are so transparent and just look like they belong on this leaf. These other ones over here now look a bit more stylized, and although they really pop, they don't look as realistic. So I'm wondering if we add local color to these, if we can make them look part of the leaf. Let's try. I'm just gonna take some watered down green, and I'm gonna paint over it, but not on the highlight. I'm just going to paint around the highlight, work quickly, and then dab it off with my paper towel. This is called glazing, when you put a light, thin layer of paint over top of an already painted area. And to make it not so dark, I'm just going to lift it with my paper towel. I'm liking it so far. Aren't those looking a bit more realistic than this one here? Let's just put some green on this one too. Cool, I like that effect. That's awesome. That was fun. Now I'm just going to make one final touch and put a little bit of light yellow green down the middle of my leaf. And that will be it. Thanks for watching, and I hope that I made it simple enough that you could follow along and make your own water droplets. If you have any questions, ask me in the comments below. And if you like this video, please give it a like. For those of you who encouraged me to make this video, I really appreciate you, and I can't wait to see the water droplets that you produce. Have fun painting. Perfect. I love it. Very happy.